Okay, class, welcome to sentence structure video number 2 of 4. Tonight's video is going to be a little bit shorter than the last one, and it'll probably actually be the shortest in the series of 4. I will only be covering one slide, and then I will be switching to a worksheet that I will share on Google Classroom for you that you need to either print or do on a separate piece of paper. Either one is acceptable, and I'll explain that more when I get to the worksheet itself. So today we're going to focus on independent and dependent clauses. We focused on the 4 sentence types. We focused on cumulative and loose sentences. Now we're going to start breaking down the sentence into its individual parts. So the first one we're going to look at is this idea of a independent clause or a main clause. It's essentially a complete sentence. It contains both a subject, it contains a verb, and it can stand on its own as a sentence. So it's independent. Okay, so it has the subject, it has the verb, it makes sense completely on its own. The easiest way to figure out if it's an independent clause is to go in and figure out if it has a subject and a verb. Okay, or a subject and a predicate. So we walked to the park. So we underline the subject once, then we underline the verb twice, and we see here that we have a prepositional phrase. So that still is part of a sentence, but the sentence "we walked to the park" is a full, complete sentence. So we would label it with an I for independent. Okay, so any full, complete sentence, not extra stuff on top of it, but one full, complete sentence, that is an independent or a main clause. The reason I say main clause is that when we get to the next video, it's going to actually start combining independent and dependent clauses together. So you need to know the difference between the idea of if it's the main one or if it's not the main one. Okay, so this next one we're going to look at is the idea of a dependent clause. I'm going to actually add something here to this. It's a dependent or a subordinate clause. Subordinate meaning is that it comes secondary and it means less than the rest. Okay, so even though it contains a subject and a verb, it cannot stand on its own and make sense. Okay, so yes, that sounds kind of weird because it should stand on its own. It should make sense because it has a subject and a verb, but it's missing something. Okay, so I don't want to say missing something. It's got something extra in it to make it more difficult to stand on its own. So they always begin with a subordinating conjunction. Okay, and that's why sometimes we get the subordinate clause aspect there. So it begins with subordinating conjunctions. Subordinating conjunctions are, this is not a complete list. These are just the most common ones. After, before, when, where, while, unless, than, that, although, because, as, and until. If you want a complete list, just Google the complete list. There's about 80 of them in there, and they're ones you use all of the time. But it's something, the idea is that when you use the word after or use the word before, it makes that phrase, that clause that comes after it, be less important than the main idea of the sentence. Okay, let me show you what I mean. Looking at the sample. Before we go to the store, we must stop by the park. So we have the we and we have the go. So we have one subject, one verb. We have another subject, we must stop, is another subject and verb. Now looking at this though, because the word before is here, because it's a subordinating conjunction, if we were to put a period here and just go before we go to the store and have the sentence end there, the sentence doesn't make sense. It doesn't say what we have to do before we go to the store. So it needs clarification, it needs more information, and that's why we call it dependent or subordinate. It's subordinate to the main, as in the main provides the information, or it's dependent to the independent. So it depends on information from the main clause. So if we label these here, this we would label with a D for dependent, and this we would label as an I for independent. So this sentence actually has 2 clauses in it. It has the dependent and it has the independent. Okay, if you do just a dependent clause on its own, it's actually what we call a fragmented sentence because it doesn't have a main idea. Even though it has a subject and verb, it doesn't have a main idea. So before we go to the store, we must stop by the park. We must stop by the park can stand on its own, but before we go to the store cannot. Okay, now the worksheet. I'm switching to the screens to the worksheet really quick. Okay, so I shared the worksheet for you on Google Classroom. You are not required to print it out, but you are required to do both pages. I'm going to go through the instructions really quick. And with this, we will go over it at the beginning of class tomorrow as a way to see how you're picking up things, but noticing placement of where the clauses are. Okay, so in the first worksheet, if you choose not to print this and you want to write it, you can just number the paper 1 through 20 and write the word subordinate or independent with each one. Okay, so with the first one, it gives you the sample up here. It gives you it gives you sample definitions. It gives you sample of what you're looking for. Here in the instructions, it tells you that for each of the following sentences, you need to identify the underlined word group by writing above it independent, IND, or sub. If you're doing this on a separate piece of paper, just label or just write out the end or the sub. If you're printing it out, you can put it above or you can just put it on the side. So you're looking at what is underlined and looking at the sample. Okay. The second page is a little bit more writing. So again, it still gives you your samples up here, but here it only gives you part of the sentence. It gives you just the dependent aspect. So you need to write the sentence using this as your dependent or your subordinate clause, and then you need to add an independent to it. So as on the lines provided, add independent clauses to the following subordinate clauses to express complete thoughts. Make sure each sentence begins with a capital letter and has end punctuation. If you're printed this out, you can do this right here. If you're writing it on a piece of paper, just number 1 through whatever it is, 1 through 10, and or just write the sentence on the paper. Okay, have a good night, and I will see you in class tomorrow, and we will start with independent and subordinate clauses.